So thank you for welcoming me at VTE once again. It's not the first time. So my name is François Crépeau. I'm a professor of international law at McGill University in Montreal. I'm also the director of the McGill Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. If you want to know what legal pluralism is, that's another 3 hours. I've been since 2011 until next July the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants. And I've been working on migration issues for 33 years now. And I'm not going to stop, I think. That's not going to change. I haven't really prepared anything because this was an ongoing discussion, but I would like to know what you want me to talk about. I can start a conversation with you on several issues. One issue which is very prominent now is global migration governance and the global compact process. And I've done interviews this last 24 hours with people who are in the know, and so it's very fresh. So that's one thing I can talk about. Another thing I can talk about is the human rights of migrants generally. What are the issues? I've done a number of country visits, and there are issues regarding the human rights of migrants, issues depending on what kind of migrants we're talking about. Certainly undocumented migrants is one category with a specific set of issues. Temporary migrant workers with very precarious situations, and that is another series, or involves another series of human rights issues. Expats, asylum seekers, unaccompanied minors, families. I mean, there are a number of issues that are quite prominent, so that's another topic. Another topic is the human rights mechanisms at the UN. I know now, the learning curve has been steep, but I know quite well now the human rights special procedures, how we function, how we contribute, how that works, if that's of interest to you.
I think if you agree that it's a really fresh issue and a really fresh topic, that you maybe talk about the global compact. It's like a kind of concept, maybe you can briefly introduce. Thank you.
Can do that. So, small historical introduction. Global governance of migration is at most 10 years old. It was not talked about before 10 years ago. Migration has always been considered by states, apart from the refugee part, which has since the 20s had a legal framework in international law. But the rest of the migration issues were never a subject matter for multilateral discussions. States considered this is territorial sovereignty, we decide, and especially the UN has nothing to do with it. In regional fora, it may have been a subject of discussion. For example, the EU decided on the free movement of persons space, the Schengen space and the EU space, with a number of rules, and that affects local migration. But what they did was to push migration controls and the sovereignty issue to the external borders. And so they have reduced certainly the controls inside the EU, but they have thickened the external borders of the EU. At multilateral level, at global level, states did not want to talk about migration. And they were saying, well, that's one of the sentences you could hear 10, 20 years ago, migration is not a UN subject. Yet the UN tried in different ways to get into the issue. For example, the Cairo Summit in 1994 on population and development had a chapter 10, which was very interesting on migration and mobility. And it remains chapter 10 of the Cairo conference, and it is still a reference document. It has been followed by no effect for a very long time. There were quite a number of initiatives. The the trying to remember the exact title. There was the commission, global commission on name doesn't come.
International migration.
So no, there was a global commission in the mid 2000s, late 1990s, which tried to touch migration and on global governance, the Commission on Global Governance, tried to touch governance of migration, states pushed back. There was this global commission on international migration, in which was started in 2003, had a report in 2005, and we know who the secretary of the commission was, and we know that, because he said it publicly numerous times, he said, we had a very innovative report, and the states neutered it before it could come out. And they cut everything that was interesting. States did not want anything to do with migration. So Kofi Annan was smart. And Kofi Annan decided we need to do something. We need to bring migration inside the UN. And Kofi Annan's legacy really materialized this year when IOM joined the UN, the International Organization for Migration, joined the UN in September 2016. It started in 2005. Kofi Annan smartly decided that he had to do a political move, and he decided to appoint a special representative of the Secretary General. Who did he appoint? Peter Sutherland. That may tell you something, Peter Sutherland. Certainly you've been working with Peter Sutherland probably at one point. Peter Sutherland was former Attorney General of Ireland, former European Commissioner, former last director of the GATT, first director of the WTO, chair of the board of Goldman Sachs, chair of the board of the LSE, London School of Economics, and I'm told that the next library of the LSE will be called the Peter Sutherland Library. Knows nothing about migration. And that was the point. He was someone that the states trusted. And he probably was someone who, although he knew nothing about migration, believed that mobility was important. But for Kofi Annan, the important thing is, who was the person who would bring the states to the table to start the conversation? And so Peter Sutherland helped the UN start a conversation with states. And they did that in a very incremental way over the past 10 years. So that was, the appointment happened at the end of 2005, started working in 2006, decided that there would be a first high-level dialogue on migration at the UN. A high-level dialogue is a day of discussion at the General Assembly on a special topic. It had never happened on migration. It had happened on refugees, not on migration. And the first one was held in 2006. One day of discussion in New York at the General Assembly between states who, for the first time in the history of the UN, talked about migration policies. And did not decide to have another high-level dialogue, did not adopt any kind of outcome document, negotiated outcome document, nor plan of action, nothing. It was just a summary by the chair. But the fact that they came to the discussion was the success. Then, what was initiated by a number of states and by Peter Sutherland was the Global Forum on Migration and Development. The Global Forum, as Rosa knows very well, is a, remind me the four words, state-led, non-binding, voluntary, and there's a fourth word so that everyone understands that it's you go there and you make absolutely no commitment to whatever, which was the important thing. States had to come and feel that they were free from making commitments and that they were free to talk to one another about migration policies. This is coming at in 2000, the first was 2007 if I'm not mistaken. 2007, this is the first one, Brussels if I'm not mistaken. held in Brussels, and since then it's been once in the north, once in the south, with an alternating nature. States, we have to remember 10 years ago, migration was already a very toxic political issue in many states. Jean-Marie Le Pen had won his first mayorship in 1982. There had been a number of xenophobic nationalist parties in Germany, minority ones, but fueling a toxic conversation. In many countries, you had Berlusconi in Italy. You had in many countries you had already that populist. So states were nervous about discussing migration. They didn't want that to reverberate during an electoral campaign. So the GFMD was the place that was created thanks to Sutherland, thanks to the UN, but it was outside the UN, state-led in the 4 words I mentioned, means not UN. And not UN means not committed to the UN normative structure. States themselves have obligations, but it's not under the aegis of the UN. It's detached from the UN. And it's still like this 10 years later. So every time there's a state that will welcome the GFMD, it's the state that sets the agenda, invites colleagues, invites other states, and then today the GFMD's meeting, the last one was in Dhaka in December. I don't know how many countries precisely came, but probably 155 countries come to the meeting. That's huge. That's more than several UN organizations in terms of membership.
Switzerland had 862.
Sorry?
Switzerland had 862 in
People.
2011.
862, no, not 860,
162.
Yeah,
Sorry.
162 states, so that's even better. And come also business, there's a business community, and the Dhaka Summit had the biggest parallel business migration community event. And so this is a voice that they are trying to invigorate. The NGOs have been invited, and this was also an incremental process. When Sutherland started the GFMD, there was only states were invited. These were closed-door sessions mostly, and human rights was not on the table at all. It was about economic migration. Mexico was the convener of the GFMD in 2010, invited NGOs, put human rights on the agenda. And suddenly the tone changes. But the states have come for 4 times already. This is the 4th GFMD. So they're not afraid anymore of NGOs and of human rights. And that's, so the process of discussing publicly without fear, within certain limits. I mean, there is still, so now the format is quite interesting. It's 2 days of NGO meetings, 1 day of common space, 2 days of state meetings, including half a day of closed-door state meeting. And when they say closed door, in fact, the doors are not very closed. They're closed enough, but actually there are many people who sneak in. Anyway, the format is well organized, and it is a real discussion about many issues. It is still a bit cautious, because it's states. So it's quite cautious. The NGO days are more daring. The state discussion is still very cautious. There's no talk about opening borders, there's no talk, security is an important topic, but economic benefits are an important topic because states are desperately trying to find a discourse that can convince their electorate during the next electoral campaign that actually migration is a good thing, and they haven't found this magic recipe yet. So the GFMD is a very important, has been a very important icebreaker in the conversations between states. Within the UN, you have the Global Migration Group, which is a grouping of 18, now 19 UN agencies and organizations, UNHCR, ILO for migrant workers, UNICEF for migrant children, UN Women for migrant women. I mean, many of those organizations do not have migrants as a core preoccupation. It's 10% of their constituency. But And so it was never a priority for them. So the GMG served the purpose of forcing them to bring together issues and discuss those issues, even though it might not have been the reflex, because simply it's a small thing. For UNICEF, migrant children is a small constituency. So it's not a priority. And there has been times where there was not even one person in UNICEF in charge of migrant children. So now it's a bit better. WHO, there was no one in charge of the health of migrants for 5 or 6 years, straddling 2007 to 2013, probably. Not one person. We have in the world approximately 250 million migrants. Not one person in charge of their health at WHO. That's a huge country. 250 million migrants, yeah.
Can I ask a very naive question?
Yes.
How do you define migrants? For example, a seasonal worker, is that a migrant?
Yes.
Somebody who offers services in another country for a year and then returns, is that
Yes.
a migrant?
Yes. A migrant is any person who lives in a country which is not his or her country of nationality for whatever time, as long as they're not a simple tourist.
But some go there?
As long as they're not a tourist, as long as they're not there just for visits. Family, my mother-in-law coming for 3 weeks to Montreal, that doesn't count as a migrant because it's a visitor. If you exclude that, anyone who lives, it could be short-term, a 6-month, an executive working 6 months at one of the companies of the conglomerate is a migrant. They need a work permit. They will be taxed on the income they earn there, etc., etc. So that's the asylum seeker is a local resident. For how long, we don't know. Could be short, could be long, we don't know. Seasonal workers, they're here for 6 months, 8 months, depending on the time. But that's, they earn money, they pay taxes, they are residents, even if it's short term. So that counts as migrants.
You were referring to the fact that countries actually welcome to the opportunity to discuss migration issues at an international level, because that might help them with addressing populists
In part, yeah.
feelings back home. When you said that, made a statement along these lines, I was thinking, well, how will this whole debate be influenced by the Trump administration?
Mm-hmm. What I would say is that states have been stumped by the migration issue for a long time. Most of their economists will tell them, it's a good thing. Business community will whisper in their ear, it's a good thing. This is happening. Let them in. One of the reasons for Angela Merkel opening the door to the Syrians in 2015 was a report by the German foundations. There was a report in April of 2015 to Angela Merkel by 12 or 16 German foundations, Volkswagen Foundation, Siemens Foundations, etc. And they said, we need those workers, let them in. I think Angela Merkel was moved by, first, a moral duty towards refugees, but also by a very pragmatic business interest mind. So that is what states receive. And then they have all these polls telling them that if they say anything good about migration, they're losing points in the polls. And so they fear that. And they haven't been able to develop a discourse, a positive discourse on migration. The best that we can expect from politicians, even those who have the heart in the right place and a moral compass, etc., is silence. We've had, for example, Alain Juppé has been pretty silent during when he was, campaigning to be president. He spent 1 year in Montreal, and he was taught in the Canadian way of doing migration, and he thought it was very interesting. He couldn't say any of this in the campaign in France because, you know, he was going to lose and he lost anyway, because François Fillon decided to go on an anti-immigration agenda. So this is the problem, and I could go very quickly. The argument goes, just to explain that so that it's intelligible. Electoral democracies function with electoral incentives. It's the best system we've ever invented to govern ourselves. But it functions with electoral incentives. Politicians pay attention to voters because voters can reward them or punish them. And this has worked well for women, for gays and lesbians, for persons with disabilities, for Aboriginals in my country. Suddenly there was a pool of voters out there which was vocal about their marginalization, their rights, and politicians adapted the policies, adapted the discourse. Doing a sexist joke, if you're not Trump or Berlusconi today, is actually damaging for a political career. Doing an anti-gay or homophobic joke today, in many countries, not in most countries, but in many countries, is very damaging for your reputation. Because there has been pressure, because voters were out there saying, well, you know, you can continue making sexist jokes, you'll see your results in the polls next time. Migrants don't vote. So there's a whole issue about what it means to have human rights, and we realize that human rights in that political context is about citizens' rights, mostly. Foreigners have great difficulty enforcing their rights because they're not part of the political constituency, they're not part of the political body, they have no voice on the political stage. Courts are still good for migrants. We've seen it with, you know, the judges stopping the ban, and we've seen, what did we just see?
Kenya. Kenya.
In Kenya, a judge just declared unconstitutional the closure of the Dadaab camp, which has been decided by, that's the biggest refugee camp in the world. 260,000 people, Dadaab in Kenya, and the government had announced that all the Somalis there had to go back home, and that they were closing the camp. And the judge today said, this is an act of collective persecution, this is unconstitutional. So judges who are not swayed by populist arguments, but look for the coherence of the legal system, will listen to arguments in favor of foreigners' rights. But in the public debate, in the public policy debate, they're not present, they're not there, and we have this extraordinary situation of policies about migration made systematically by people who have no idea what migration is about. When, in most cases, policies for women are made by committees where there are women. Policies about persons with disabilities are made in committees where there are persons with disabilities. It is made usually by the people most concerned with the government, etc. And then it's implemented with the persons who are most concerned. Very often migration policies are made by non-migrants, not very often, most often, made by non-migrants, implemented by non-migrants. The migrants are objects of the policies, not subjects of the policy debate. So that's the explanation why the migrants have difficulty getting into the public policy debate.
But that's the point.
I'm deviating from what I had announced, but that's okay. I love the conversation.
Well, the latter point I would say, yes, in many European countries you could indeed make that point. I mean, that migration is not necessarily something that most of us would have experienced or have a family tradition with, but the United States or Canada, I mean, these are countries that are built by migrants, and often as recent as second-generation politicians are from migrant families.
That may explain in part the fact that in Canada we still have a comfortable majority of people who think that migration is either an excellent or a good thing for the country. That also explains why in the US you actually have a political debate on migrants. There was a divide between the Democrats and the Republicans pre-Trump. Since Trump, everything is muddled, so we don't really know what's happening. But pre-Trump, there was a real debate. And the reason was, next to the 11 undocumented Mexican migrants, which is the centerpiece of the debate, what to do with them, amnesty or integrate, that's the big debate. You have 40 million Americans of Latino descent who vote. So you really have a constituency there. And many of them are interested in what is happening to the 11 undocumented. So there you have a constituency. You have people who are voting on that issue. In Canada, we don't have that big community. We don't have one majority community in Canada. We have a big number of Somalis, we have Sri Lankans, we have Tamil Sri Lankans, we have lots of Chinese, and we have Taiwanese, and we have, and they don't form one constituency. They don't necessarily discuss with one another, they don't talk, they don't form alliances, that's not what they do. The difference is really the fact that there is the weight of 40 million Latino or American voters of Latino origin. But that's a difference. I would say the difference is there. In Europe, you very often don't have that weight either. Except in France, maybe, for the Algerians, and in Germany with the Turks. Now, in Germany with the Turks, you don't necessarily have the citizenship. Many of the Turks in Germany still don't have citizenship, or only very recently got it. In France, the fact that most people of Algerian origin still vote should play something in the political system, but you have very few political figures of Algerian descent, which makes the debate very difficult. Anyway, closing the parenthesis, at the UN, so Kofi Annan managed to succeed in his plan to bring migration at the UN. We've had now 11 years of Global Forum. We've had a second high-level dialogue at the General Assembly in 2013. This time we had a declaration, surprise declaration, negotiated outcome, no plan of action. Let's not exaggerate. So the states still came up with a declaration, which is a negotiated outcome, which mentioned human rights 6 times in 5 pages. I was very happy, because it was a surprise. And we hope there will be another high-level dialogue. It's been announced for 2019, because states have until now resisted the call to make the high-level dialogue regular, every 5 years, every 4 years. But they take ad hoc decisions. So the next one will be decided later. But we hope that this one in 2019 will come out with a declaration and plan of action, and then we'll be able to start having benchmarks and accountability mechanisms. We'll see. In the meantime, Europe faced a migration crisis, what politicians and the public and the media call a migration crisis. And we can define what is a migration crisis. Kenneth Roth, the head of Human Rights Watch, said if we have a crisis in Europe, it's not a crisis of capacity, it's a crisis of political leadership. That's what we have. Because as Angela Merkel said, she said, "Wir schaffen das." Is that the right thing? Yes, we can. That's translation, Obama translation. Yes, we can. And certainly, Europe could cope. Europe could completely cope with the numbers. If it had gotten its act together, which it hasn't, and still now hasn't really. If there had been some leadership, it would have been dealt with and organized and settled. But because of all sorts of electoral dates and deadlines, and because of toxic nature of certain governments, I'm thinking of Hungary in particular, this did not happen. And so we have this migration crisis. And the European migration crisis sort of created an appetite for better global governance. Europe felt that and certainly the European Commission was completely sidelined, and marginalized by the European states on that issue until the new Commission, which has taken office about 2 years ago. The previous Commission was completely sidelined by the states. The Commission was not in charge of the policy. And that's a change for the European Union. For those of you who know the European Union well, you know that the Commission initiates legislation and the Council is the legislator but can only accept or refuse, co-legislator with Parliament, that can only accept or refuse. That's the rule. It never happened on migration issues. The Council is the representatives of the governments, and on migration they said, this is our problem. As long as you want us to adopt stuff that we don't want to do at national level, we won't listen, we'll do our own stuff. And they, very often, they had meetings on migration issues and adopted collectively, at national level, they adopted the same type of policies, completely outside the European institutions. So we have had a revolt of states against the European Union's methodology, traditional methodology. And we've seen that after the last European elections, the new Commission has aligned itself on the Council and is now doing what the Council wants. Because that's the only way that the Commission has a role. So what the Council wanted and what the European governments wanted was more repression of irregular migration, more repression of traffickers and smugglers, and a cooperation with transit states to stop migration on their territory or at their border. So the peace statement with Turkey, and now we have negotiations with Libyan factions, which are not government, and the reports from the detention centers in Libya are horrendous. And in Valletta, last Friday, states that said that they would work towards making the detention conditions in Libya better. That's scary. That doesn't sound like a commitment. That doesn't sound like a limit to detention. It's just, okay, Libya's going to detain them and we'll try to, make sure that they're not too badly treated. That's very weak. But that's the European Union position because of a number of governments who are adamantly anti-immigration. Now, at global level, that created a call for imagination, because those governments at European level and in the rest of the world, the Australian government has a good immigration policy for immigration selected abroad, but very harsh policies for asylum seekers who arrive by boats in particular. And they're all looking for strategies to avoid this toxic issues. How can we not lose election and speak positively of migration? They're all trying to find ways of doing this, which they haven't been able to do for 25 years, and it's quite difficult. And they see how much Canada, the US, Australia are a success because of migration, and they would like to emulate that very often. Maybe not on the same scale, but they would like to emulate that. But they're not able to create the type of discourse necessary to get there. So what do? Well, you do with the multilateral level what many countries have done with the EU. When they wanted to change legislation at home, they made sure that the EU would adopt the legislation, and then they could say, well, it's not me, it's Brussels. Sorry, but they were very happy with the result. And so the idea is, can we bring at global level, at multilateral level, a better cooperation, coordination, a better discussion of migration issues so that we can come to a common solution, common understanding, and bring then this down in the discussions at national or regional level. Regional level is very important. It has been developed that you have the EU situation, but what has been developed since much before the first regional organization is the IGC, started very probably in the early 80s, trying to stop Iranian refugees on Turkish territory with funding from France, US, Canada, Germany, Britain, etc. But that was secret, and it was secret until 1990 when there was a meeting at Niagara-on-the-Lake, and then many documents were leaked, and we learned of the existence of the IGC. It's called the Intergovernmental Consultations on Migration and Asylum in North America, Europe, and Australia, or something like that. It was a very long name. It still has the main office is still in Geneva. They still exist. It's the oldest, and so it's a northern, global north group of states that discuss migration issues. If you go on their website, I don't know how it is now, I checked last time, maybe a year and a half ago, it's a white page with a space for a password. And it's written, this website is only accessible to select civil servants of countries or something like that. That's the type of secrecy. We're talking about migration policies, and it's like a secret website.
Well, but it's not made. You can't find many things inside, like statistics.
Probably there's not much,
yeah.
but it's. I would say it's old school. It was the first regional consultative processes were very, very discreet, if not secret. In recent years, it has changed, and they have evolved. IGC is much more open to discussion these days. They are much more, because the threat is less important. States are talking publicly. It's not as it was in the 80s and 90s. But you now have probably 16, if not more, regional consultative processes in the world. You have 2 or 3 across the Mediterranean. You have 2 or 3 in Eastern Central Europe. You have 3 in Africa. You have the Colombo process for the countries of emigration of South Asia, Southeast Asia. The Abu Dhabi dialogue, which is the countries of the Colombo process with the Gulf states. So that discussion between the countries of emigration and countries of immigration. And you have several processes in Central America as well. You have 2 processes in Central America. So you have all these processes, which are places where states discuss. And if you look at the definition of those processes, there are spaces for policy discussions. Not normative, non-normative, absolutely non-normative. And they're always, state-led, voluntary, non-binding, and there's another word that I can't remember. And it's the same thing. And in these policy spaces, decisions are made. We see out of those discussions the states that discuss adopting the same kind of hardware and software for integrated border management. But it's not a decision. And there's often very, very little reporting of what happens in those regional consultative processes. They are discreet because states don't want to create the type of toxic debate about what they do, and they want efficiency. And it's interesting to see that if you have a state that is close to the interests of the global north, so Mediterranean, for example, the focus is very often on border control. In its various forms, fighting smuggling, fighting trafficking, creating better integrated border management, cooperation with coast guards, border guards, training of personnel, etc. If you look at regional consultative processes which are more geared to interests of the South, you suddenly see an interest in better managed remittances processes, better training of migrants, matching of skills between needs, employers' needs and migrant workers, protection of the rights of migrants. You see a much more, because suddenly the countries of emigration are part of it, and they have a different agenda. And what we see over the years is that these processes, which often started with a very small agenda, have been made much more complex, much more sophisticated. They even have now a sort of a development framework, trying to create development opportunities. But they're still very discreet.
In the short time, it seems like, for
10 years.
How do you see the future? Where do you think we'll be?
I'm getting there, because immediately after that comes, with the European crisis in 2012, 13, 14, the Syrian crisis and its European consequences, states have decided to get together. And they now are accustomed to speaking to one another through GFMD, through RCPs, and the high-level dialogues, etc. in 2013. So there was, in the spring of 2016, a will by the Secretary General to convene I would say not a grand bargain, but a grand discussion at the UN to make it officially a UN subject matter. And so there was a report by the Secretary General in May last year, which called for a conference in September, which happened last September, on the 19th of September in New York. And on that occasion, states adopted the New York Declaration, which is an extraordinary declaration, listing all the issues that affect migrants, including all the human rights issues. It was a very well done document, non-binding. It's a sort of a political declaration of everything that needs to be done. That's how it's sort of conceived. But at least states have given themselves sort of an agenda for the coming decades, and that's an interesting way of doing things. The procedure that was put in place, thanks to the Secretary General, thanks to Peter Sutherland, because it was also Peter Sutherland who was behind this, and a number of states who were leading, Switzerland in particular, but also Mexico, Bangladesh. I mean, you had a number of states who were particular leaders, Germany. And Turkey last year, because Sweden had received the GFMD in 2014 and Turkey in 2015. So the Turkey was also a big player. And they decided to have global compacts, 2 global compacts, one on refugees, one on migration. And this idea of 2 global compacts to be negotiated was adopted on the 19th of September. The 2 global compacts need to be negotiated in the next 2 years. So there will be a conference, right? 2 years. 2 years. There will be a conference in the fall of 2018 to adopt the 2 global compacts. Now, the day after, on the 20th of September, no one knew what that meant. Because there was no process. And there was no definition of any outcome document. There was nothing. It was just the promise that we would have global compacts. And no one knew what a global compact was. Because it doesn't exist it's not somehow it's not even a legal word. Compact.
It's a new concept, let's say.
Exactly. You have to take it out. It was a word that was not legal that they brought into, like, for example, the agenda, the 2030 agenda. It's not a legal word, and that allows multiple interpretations. It's much better than treaty. Oh, on migration, no one wants a treaty. It's binding, we know what it is. Agenda, compact, no definition, you take it as you wish. That's the kind of thing that states will agree upon. And that's smart. It's smart diplomatic skills. And to me, that's very important. It brings the states together, even if they are brought together on something they don't quite understand, but they're brought together. And so we had no process, no definition of any outcome of the compact. Now the process is clear. What is happening very quickly on refugees, the expectations are small, because refugee law has been there for a long time. UNHCR is the guardian of the 1951 Convention, and UNHCR is leading the process to the Global Compact. And what is expected is that states will commit again to the same normative framework that was established in 1951, and will probably commit a bit more to better resettlement and more money for transit countries for refugees. And probably there will be something about people fleeing countries in conflict. So there's a MICIC, migration in countries in conflict. There's a MICIC process into that will be built into that. It's not very innovative, but if it brings states to do better on refugees, it will serve a purpose. On migration, it's a blank slate. The Global Compact on migration is totally blank slate. There's nothing in the books at international level to say what it's going to be. So they started by appointing co-facilitators. That was Mexico and Switzerland, who were appointed by the states as co-facilitators for the first phase, defining the process. They will very probably be reappointed as co-facilitators for the substantive part of the consultations and negotiation within the 2 years. But it's they've been appointed for 7 months just to define the process. And now the process is quite well defined. We have a timetable. There will be consultations there will be a report of the Secretary General in March on a roadmap, a work plan it's called, on a work plan. There will be consultations from April to October, and starting in January, and there will be a report by the Secretary General as a result of the consultations, and starting in January, going till September, October 2018, there will be negotiations. And I think the negotiations will stop in June so that they can draft the outcome document that will be adopted.
That's the governmental side. On
Yeah.
the other side, you have, for example, Swiss Civil Society, which is Swiss Civil Society Platform on Migration and Development, which are planning to organize a conference and the process to define from the point of view of civil society what this global compact is.
Mm-hmm.
So there are many actors.
Yeah, and in the work plan, in the process that has been devised and which has been adopted in a resolution on modalities, well, we still have a final draft. It will be adopted in March, but we have a final draft of the resolution on modalities. In the consultation that will take place between April and November next year, all stakeholders will be invited, and that's very clear. So UN human rights mechanisms are invited, all the UN organizations, regional organizations, civil society, trade unions. It's written. Everyone is part of it because they want to buy in. Doesn't mean that the end result will be, everyone will be happy with the end result, but everyone will be part of the consultation. So we're at now a draft resolution on modalities which has been adopted. We have a timetable for the consultation and the negotiations with weeks. So, the co-facilitators have done that. It's quite well done, and it's been adopted last week. And then when you ask the co-facilitators, okay, what will be the substantive content of the compact? No one knows.
Yet.
Yes, well, yeah, absolutely. No one knows. It will be happening during the consultation, and then states will see what they can negotiate. So it really is it's really an open-ended process. Usually, when you have a process for the negotiation of any topic in an international forum, there is somewhere a draft that is maybe shredded by the delegations and replaced by something else. But you start with a draft. Here there's no draft. There's the New York Declaration, which states all the problems that need to be solved. Human rights of migrants must be respected. The rights of migrant workers must be respected. We must fight xenophobia. We must ensure that migrants can access unions and can access justice. And we must ensure that there's no police violence. And we must ensure that borders are open because states need the migrant workers, and we have to facilitate migrant workers, the entry of migrant workers. But at the same time, states need to be able to control their borders, and states need to be able to return migrants who are not allowed to come, etc. So everything is on the table. How the mix will come out of the machine, what mix will come out of the machine, we don't know. What is interesting is that actually this process follows the SDG process and the climate change process. The SDGs have several mentions of migration throughout the SDGs. And one of them, the one I think is key, is Target 10.7, in which states have committed to facilitating regular, safe, states have committed to facilitating migration and mobility. That's interesting. It's very important, and in the SDGs it makes sense. All the economists agree, migration is good for development. It's good for the country of origin, it's good for the country of destination. It's good for both. It creates, it accompanies the economic development, it creates entrepreneurship, it creates businesses, it creates jobs, it creates flows of money, it creates flows of savoir-faire, of know-how, etc. So it is good, but states cannot say it. But in a document like the SDG, buried in Target 10.7, there was no chance of it being toxic, so it's there. And we now see states coming around with this process of global compacts, coming to the process with the idea that it actually would be good for development if we had a coherent, non-toxic migration policy. And somehow they will be looking for the magic formula that will sort of take the toxicity out of the debate. Last point. I was in a scenario building exercise for the first 3 days of this week in Château de Bossé near Geneva. And we had several people from different countries, different organizations, including the head of IGC was there. And when you build scenarios, we were building scenarios for 15 years, for the next 15 years, in terms of migration. And there was the catastrophe scenario, nuclear war, and there was the techno scenario where half the jobs disappear replaced by robots, and there was another scenario where every country becomes nationalist and populist, and there was the R scenario, which was about overcoming the populist hump and resuming our muddled way of actually getting better and better at resolving the issues on this planet. So one, for example, of the issues that came out, which I think is a smart idea, is that the G20, we said in 2024, but it could be much earlier, we have no idea who's put it there. The G20 makes migration a permanent item on its agenda. Takes on the issue. So we have the ministers of finance, not simply the ministers of home affairs, which normally are the head of delegation in any discussion on migration. And we would have the Ministry of Labour as well, who would start saying, well, you want to close the borders? Sorry, I want to open it. And the discussion would be at that level. And that would be very interesting, and that would create a different dynamics. So this is the kind of thing that states will be looking for in the coming years. And I think that if we think a bit more long-term than what's coming to us running, there will be another mandate after Trump's. There will be, even if Geert Wilders and Marine Le Pen come to power one way or another, at one point they'll exit power, there will be something else. And hopefully their stint in power will have proven that their solutions simply don't work, and that we need to find something else. And so looking into the horizon, towards a horizon of 15 years or 20 years, doing long-term strategic planning as we do for most policies, infrastructure, energy, food security. We always do strategic planning for 25 years. We don't do that on migration. So we'll need to do it and think long-term, think facilitating migration and mobility. You
said the Global Compact. It seems that there's no draft behind it. No idea, just the concept.
I think, if finish, sorry.
Did I understand it more or less? Yeah, it's an open thing. So,
yeah.
If you compare, if you remember the meeting we met in 2013, OECD NOMAD, policy and institutional coherence, the outcomes of that, and then you compare the Swiss presidency's GFMD 2011 with the also coherent theme, and then you think about the whole of government approach and the structural EMZ of the Swiss government, and you compare it with the multi-layered governance. Don't you think that, keeping in mind that Switzerland has a lead on that, don't you think it could be that it's a logical evolution of the whole of government approach. They somehow started here because that was at the beginning the idea. We don't do the whole of government approach only within borders.
Yeah.
We go beyond borders and try to keep the whole world also in this whole of government approach and multi-layer governance so that we have everybody.
Yeah, and I would say this is in the New York Declaration of the 19th of September. The idea that the discussions on migration should not be the purview of ministers of home affairs only.
Right.
That there are many other dimensions that must be taken into account. It has to be whole of government's approach. Everyone agrees on that. The problem is that everyone agrees that business community wants more open borders, that migrants' rights must be protected, that it has to be a whole of government approach, that we must do integration policies, and that migrant kids must do well at school, and that we all agree on everything, except that if the politicians start saying that publicly, they're eliminated from the political map. So how do you translate this into political action and political discourse? That's the issue. And for the moment, with the political pushback, the populist nationalist pushback, we have to continue to muddle through the constraints of the political stage as we know it. And so these discussions will take a long time. We have 2 years to do them. Some people are talking about adding 1 year and making the adoption of the Global Compact on Migration at the high-level dialogue of 2019 instead of at the same time as the Global Compact on Refugees in 2018. So adding another year. We'll see whether that happens or not. That's a process. I think that on the content, you read the New York Declaration, everything's there. Except that no country can bring this back as a political agenda. So, quite possibly, the Global Compact will list a number of issues. Here I have a draft report by the SRSG, which has not been made public yet, but recommendations are managing crisis-related movements and protecting migrants at risk, building opportunities for labour and skills mobility, ensuring orderly migration including return, fostering migrants' inclusion and development, strengthening migration governance capacities.
Everything.
Have your cake and eat it too. But we agree that these are the things to be done. How do you translate that into political action at national level will be the difficulty. But if there is an agreement at international level, it carries weight in the political discourse at national level.
You have more
past the
pressure.
populist moment.
Right. Thank you, François. We are coming to the end. May I kindly ask you to just say hello to our watchers on Facebook?
Yes.
Sabri Nari is here and other colleagues that you know. Maybe
Good.
you can.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all. And I hope this conversation will continue in person soon.
Bye.